Welcome everybody to this webinar run by the Foundation for Integrated Transport. I'm Stephen Joseph. I'm a trustee of the and chair of the foundation, and this is the second webinar we've done. We did one last year on appraisal methodology, and when we asked people what the next one should be, reducing car dependency outside cities was seen as one of the as the top issues. So we've assembled a fantastic panel of speakers to talk to you today. We have Beate Kubitz, John Austin, and then responses from Alistair Kirkbride and Marianne Quick, and from Jenny Milne and John Whiteleg, who will talk about some of the projects. All of these people have been either fellows or have been funded as part of projects by the foundation. Oh, not Jenny, but Jenny's been deeply involved in some of the projects. I'm just going to do a little bit about FIT, and then we'll launch straight into presentations from Beate, and there will be time for questions and answers at the end. Please put them in the chat function, and they'll be put, and I'll do some selections and try and get through as many as we can at the end. What we found in the past is that the chat function takes on a life of its own, which is great. So please put in comments as well as questions, and all of this is being recorded and will be available on the FIT website. So what's FIT? Let's find the slides. I hope people can see that. So very briefly, this is FIT. It was established in 2014 by the late Dr. Simon Norton, who was a world-class mathematician and renowned transport campaigner, and he had a vision of people having a right to get around without a car, travelling with a minimum impact on other people's lives and the environment, where trains and buses are integrated and safe, attractive routes are provided for walking and cycling, and barriers to transport justice are removed by means which include volunteering and social enterprise. We're one of the few grant-making trusts devoted entirely to promoting change on transport issues in the UK, and we have supported a wide range of initiatives that change public attitudes, transforming quality of bus services, increasing sustainable travel to leisure destinations, availability of public transport as a human right, making new and existing developments public transport friendly. We helped fund Transport for New Homes, supporting grassroots community action, integrating longer distance modes of transport, and helping organisations active on environmental, health and social issues to adopt transport as a priority. We give 4 types of funding: grants between 5 and 30,000 for projects that promote and deliver transport as a basic right and tackle climate change; small grants up to 2,000 to support running costs of local campaigns, grassroots groups and networks; fellowships to develop skills and experience of remarkable transport activists and researchers, some of whom you'll hear from in a minute, who are contributing to integrated transport; and a social investment fund, which makes loans, repayable grants and equity investments. Our current focus is on traffic reduction, with a particular emphasis on road use charging, and we're funding a number of projects in that space. Here's just some of the people we funded, over 50 current and past grantees, and you'll see a number of groups there who've been deeply involved, and you'll hear from 1 or 2 of them, notably Hope Valley Climate Action, later on. And here's the fellowships, some of them you'll hear from later. I hope that's worked. Good. Without more ado, I'd like to introduce the first of our speakers, Beate Kubitz. Beate, you better introduce yourself, because I know you have a number of hats. There's one other comment I should make before I let Beate speak. I have a second role with an interest in this. I'm a part-time professor at the University of Hertfordshire's Smart Mobility Unit, which has been researching and promoting discussion and research on transport outside cities, which we found isn't talked about very much. So we did one report, a set of round tables in 2020, and there's a report on that on the website. I'll put that in the chat. And we've also we've done a new set of round tables and are writing that up at the moment. And we have a range of, and we have a transport masters and various other things. And the other thing about the university is it runs its own bus company, which has over 100 buses at 3 different universities, providing general public services, not just for staff and students. So somebody's asked for the cut-off for city. We're being pretty vague about that, because actually we've been talking about transport outside cities, and for that we've talked about city regions, but that could include cities, could include Cambridge and Oxford. There's lots of research on those places, much less on what happens in smaller places. So without more ado, Beate.
Hello, and welcome. I'm just trying to share my screen with you. I'm not doing so terribly successfully, so hopefully this will work in, right. Oh, I'm afraid you're going to have to watch me scroll back through history for a second. In the world of rural internet. So, start from the beginning. My name's Beate Kubitz, and I'm a transport researcher, and in 2020 I was lucky enough to receive a FIT fellowship to research some of the things I'm interested in transport outside of cities and in peri-urban and rural areas. I'm just going to talk through a few things today, some of the things I researched, some of the things that I've come to later. Firstly, why is it important to concentrate on rural populations if they are a minority of transport? Also to look at the causes of more people driving in rural areas, and a few slides about innovations in rural situations. I think it's always important to consider what's rural, what's urban. And I'm thinking of cities being more than 50,000 people, 1,500 inhabitants per kilometre square, and rural places being basically less than 300 people per kilometre square, smaller towns and villages with everything else in between. And the reason this is important is because transport is about networks and areas. And actually, when we look at these metrics, we find that rural and urban places can nestle closely together. They can be mixed in. There can be significant lumpiness in our environment. And actually, when you look at it, more people are affected by rural areas or contained within areas that are a mixture of rural and urban than possibly we think of at first. When I was doing my research, one of the things that I thought was particularly interesting was this lumpiness within Greater Manchester, which was a neighbouring borough to me. Population in Greater Manchester is enormous, 2.2 million people, the figures bandied about, possibly even more according to my spreadsheet. But really that population concentrates in that central zone of Manchester, the city centre, what's run by Manchester City Council. The other 9 boroughs are quite different and much less dense, much lumpier, to the extent that Rochdale actually doesn't really even meet the density of the World Bank's classification of rural. So the main lesson that I took from this bit of the research was that population density and topography varies. And I looked at areas like Bolton, where you can have sort of across 12-15 mile zone, what's supposed to be an urban area, and yet has areas where there are 200 people per kilometre square, right up to 15,000 people per kilometre square. And those people, they don't just stay in their area, they travel around to and from low density areas and right through them. And the data that I looked at was trips to travel to work data, because that's what I had in 2020. And it showed very much that the trips to work can vary greatly in length. And I think the best bit of information that came out of this analysis was just how much those trips can impact an urban area. So you can see right in the middle of the map on the left, the dense zone in the centre of Manchester that we were talking about earlier. Within that area, far fewer people travel to work by car, far fewer people, I think by the time you've sort of sorted it out, only about 30% of people who travel to work in Manchester are travelling to work within that zone in a car. The other cars are all converging on that area from areas as far afield as Cheshire, and Calderdale and the Northwest, even the Lake District, people are arriving by car from the much less densely populated and much less transport heavy, as we'll see later, zones, to the extent that 75% of cars arriving in central Manchester are arriving from their homes. So establishing this is important to tackle cars outside of city centres, because that has an impact on city centres as well as on the areas that they travel through and in. I looked a little bit at what people travelling. People travel more in rural areas as a whole. We can see that in rural areas they're making 6,500 miles of travel a year, whereas people in urban areas are making 3,600 miles per year. And looking at rural areas, you can see people are further more densely spread, and that's possibly why each rural trip on average is 8.39 miles, whereas urban trips are 4.89 miles roughly per trip on average. And driving more correlates with rural areas. You can see this lovely map from Carbon Dot Place showing you just how in the centre of Manchester people drive far less frequently than average and for far shorter distances, whereas the red areas, the rural areas, the orange and the yellow areas are all people driving much more frequently, much longer distances than average. And you can see the National Travel Survey on the left, the most recent one from 2021, shows that it's still true that people are taking far more trips by car and van, either as drivers or passengers in rural areas, and walking, cycling, taking the bus and rail much more frequently as well. And you have to ask, sorry, apparently my video is not working very well, apologies. You have to ask, is this a mindset? Is it a habit? Is it just people being welded to their steering wheels? And there's a very good piece of research that I recommend everyone looks at, from 2015 by the Transport System Catapult, which classifies our population, our travelling population, by their modes. And it shows you that 50% of people are more rural and tend to be driving more. The people who are city dwellers tend to use a much greater mix of transport. These default motorists, though, they interviewed a lot of them, and they found that only 9% of people who drive really are the mini Jeremy Clarksons welded to their steering wheels. The rest of people really don't actually like driving a huge amount. They feel dependent on it. They feel they're wasting their time when they're doing this. So there is an opportunity. It's not just about a mindset or a habit. It's about an absence of alternatives as well. And this is where we can look at some maps of the provision of alternatives and how that correlates with people's use. Why do people use buses less in less urban areas? So here on the right, we have a map of Greater Manchester. And Transport for Greater Manchester helpfully mapped, gave all of their different areas a PTAL score, similar to the London PTAL score, a travel accessibility score. And those areas, when I interviewed people, I found that only those areas where there was really that dark colour dot were really useful, the more frequent bus routes. Where people have yellow or taupe or orange scores, it's really not that useful, and people weren't, those people are not finding the transport useful. So I would argue, and we all know that correlation and causation are not exactly the same thing, but there's something very powerful about this map that shows that people who are driving to work are driving to work in the outer boroughs, and the people who are not driving to work are the people in inner boroughs. And that cannot be a mere coincidence that maps with the best public transport in Greater Manchester. Again, why do fewer people walk in rural areas? It could well be a feature, and I'm sure there is something to do with it. It's definitely that people make longer trips and those are less suitable for walking in rural areas. But there's also an infrastructure piece to this. We're looking at, the top picture is a village in Calderdale, near where I live, in Calderdale, or lived in Calderdale. It's a housing estate that opens onto a road that will take you to a school and a village in less than a mile. It has what can best be described as intermittent pavements. And no one really wants to send their children to walk to school alone along this road because there are no pavements. We have a similar problem on A roads where there's no, even with villages that can be a mile or two apart where people could perfectly well walk between them, there are A roads where the traffic is far too fast and there's no provision or infrastructure. And what about bikes? Again, rural areas, the disparity is not quite so great, and yet we see on the top picture a national speed limit rural road. It's a very difficult road to traverse on a bike, I can tell you. We were fully kitted out with all of the high-vis possible when we went on this bike ride with my friend Paul, who is in a recumbent hand cycle, as you can see. So there's definitely a disincentive if you can come around a corner and find a car going 60 miles an hour when you're on a bicycle. And equally, the off-road, whilst there are increasingly national cycle networks, this is a national cycle network which I would argue is completely discontinuous. Many people cannot cross that spillway because of the lack of infrastructure there, edging across the bridge. And again, trains. Trains are less frequent in rural, and they're also less connected to the transport infrastructure. Here am I and my poodle waiting, hopefully, for someone to come and pick us up at Cam and Dursley, because onward travel's not terribly easy. So I did this very general research into where transport existed and the correlations between transport, the lack of public transport alternatives and driving. And I also interviewed people as part of the FIT research. And the interviews that I did in sort of rural-ish areas, you can see a lot of green fields in Horwich in west of Bolton, were really deeply quite depressing. I was asking people about their travel behaviour and why they were doing it, and trying to work out what the alternatives would be by active travel and public transport. And the basic message was that when you try and sort of replace cars with public transport or active travel, people were finding the time penalties too great, the uncertainties too great. Will the bus come or not? The journeys became much more complicated, and also they were afraid of walking or cycling instead of taking their cars because the infrastructure didn't exist. And even people who tried to cycle were taking what to a lot of people seem like enormous risks. I mean, as a dedicated cyclist, I recognised that what was happening in these interviews, you would quickly try and cross a 4-lane dual carriageway, but your heart is in your mouth. And frankly, to get to work, no one really wants to have their heart in their mouth at significant points on a journey. Analysing transport in these outlying areas and looking at the maps, there may be points on the map that suggest there are buses, but it suggests that the transport isn't good enough. The time penalties are too great. The journeys are too complex. The rules around fares are too difficult. And to be honest, it's really hard to tell someone to double or triple their journey time in a day which is short, which they have lots of things to do to take public transport when the cars are currently giving them options. So what do we do about this rather depressing situation? I've got 3 minutes to go through a few little solutions and tiny bits of light on the horizon. It's not about a single solution. It's about finding lots of local solutions and working with communities to create solutions. So here's a project I created in West Yorkshire, Cargodale, which is an e-cargo bike delivery service for lockdown, and it's carried on beyond lockdown, both doing deliveries and also giving people trials of cargo bikes. What's been really interesting about that is not only that we've managed to spread a bit of our knowledge to neighbouring boroughs, Kirklees, Home Valley, here trying out a cargo bike. They've set up their own project now. But we've also seen other people just spontaneously seeing our cargo bike and going out and buying them. But we did find a few things. We found that we would really like a few more segregated bike lanes, please. We would really like to see some reduced speed limits because the differentials between the cargo bikes and cars in certain places were really difficult. And we loaned out our bikes, and we discovered that a lot of people, even in rural areas where the general idea is that there's a lot of space, don't have anywhere to store them. There were people saying, yes, I'd love one of these. It would take away, the need for a second car or even a first car at times, but there's nowhere to put it. So there's also the other thing that I think is an absolute no-brainer in rural areas, given the longer trip distances, is access to e-bikes and share projects, hire projects, and things that enable people to try out e-bikes. Not forgetting walking and wheeling, because not having pavements is a really big inhibitor to people getting out and travelling between places. Picture on the top is Bath, I think between Bath Eastern and the centre of Bath. You can ride, walk, wheel, whatever, take your dog along the canal bank. It's fully sealed, so you don't get covered in dirt, and it's continuous. Unfortunately, the picture below is a similar road, but in Germany, which is one that goes between two villages. It's a great way to get sort of, I think it's about 3 kilometres between the two villages. So, but you need a really good piece of infrastructure on which people feel safe, and there are benches and lighting and all sorts of nice things. Then there's innovative public transport, because a bus that you have to walk a long distance to up a steep hill carrying a load of shopping is not really a useful bus to people. One of the things that I really liked over the last year has been looking at on-demand transport and seeing the Hertfordshire example thriving. This is a village-to-village bus service that you can book online or by app or by phone. It connects the market town, and it also connects key hubs, so you can go to the station in Stevenage. You can't use it to travel around Stevenage, but you can use it to get in and out of these rural areas to use the onward connections. One of the really interesting things is the amount of young people using it and going to college, not requiring lifts from their neighbours or friends or family, and really getting into the habit of using buses. And it's been super successful in terms of its usage over the first year. So it's all about multiple solutions. It's all about having things that just chip away on people's dependency, having local shopping and local delivery, and utilising our resources properly. The bottom picture is a rural car club in Hebden Bridge that's been going for 17 years, allowing people to share cars rather than having to have their own one. And we can't underestimate, particularly in these strapped times, the usefulness of community transport for enabling people to get out and about without using a car. So I've managed to keep it down to 60 minutes, I'm very sorry, to talking about changing the calculation to make alternatives to cars cheap, safe and attractive, because whilst the price of cars, cost of car ownership is going up on its own, we can't wean people off cars without giving them some alternative. Thank you very much for your time. Thanks also to the Foundation for Integrated Transport. I realise there was a lot in there, and if there's anything you want to ask me about specifically, please put it in the chat box. Thanks also to Panellists for giving me a lot of data on-demand transport.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
And thanks for more or less keeping to time. It's great. Without more ado, I'm going to introduce John Austin, who's been researching mobility hubs and has a long career in transport planning, and will take us through mobility hubs and what he's done, particularly in relation to the Southwest, as a way forward. John, can you share your screen?
Thank you, Stephen. Yes, I find it here. Sorry, just get that right. Where are we? Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I'm John Austin, a independent consultant and researcher. Details are in the notice of the meeting. The one thing that is no longer true is that I'm no longer secretary of the Transport Geography Research Group, having had that over to somebody else, but I'm still very much involved in that. I've called this mobility hubs an essential component of the public infrastructure needed to enable a non-car dependent lifestyle. Not sufficient, but essential. The particular project I'm doing for FIT is developing a location identification methodology for them, and that's based on data from the southwest of England, the southwest region. So I'm doing that in conjunction with the University of Plymouth, who've been great helping with that. What are mobility hubs? Well, this definition from Como UK, the shared transport charity, they're highly visible, safe and accessible spaces where public, shared and active travel modes are co-located alongside improvements to the public realm, and where relevant, and that's particularly the case in rural areas, I believe, enhance community facilities. That's a great definition as far as it goes. It talks about the co-location of facilities. It emits a direct reference to the act of interchange itself. Mobility hubs are a very diverse concept, but I submit they're fundamentally geographic. Glad that Beate mentioned networks a lot. It's all about networks, location, access and proximity. And mobility hubs apply to the three situations of urban, suburban and rural, but of course the emphasis is different in each. Rural, much more a potentially community focus, getting to somewhere or somewhere central in the rural area where facilities are, rather than necessarily leaving or using that as mobility hub to get elsewhere. When did the concept start? Well, it started in separate strands, we think from about 2003. Myself and my fellow independent colleague, Peter Warman, formulated the concept as a strategic solution in the UK in 2003, a strategic solution to traffic problems. At the same time, it was being planned, devised and implemented in Canada, particularly in Toronto, and also at the same time it was being done, planned and implemented in parts of Northern Europe, particularly Bremen, but also Bergen and parts of Belgium, and also other cities in Germany as well. There's been a later adoption in parts of the US with a particular link to shared transport, and now I would say there's to an extent a bandwagon in the UK, but with interest from many different perspectives, some of those actually, I would say, competing. What was the UK history? Well, as I say, myself and Peter Warman's research project was done for Plymouth City Council in 2003, 2004. We did another project in a suburban area, the edge of London area of southwest Hertfordshire. That's Watford and Three Rivers and parts of Hertsmere in 2008. And we set up MobiHub Limited and registered the MobiHub trademark for a particular type of mobility hub. But our attempt to generate interest in the concept elsewhere in the UK at that time largely failed. Timing, lack of government priorities in that area. But in 2015, I would say to 2019, a big interest in MUS, mobility as a service, the ability to have a single account that would give access to all sorts of shared public transport, or perhaps a single ticket that did the same thing. I would say those are really two sides of the same coin with mobility hubs, which are physical infrastructure and physical signage to go with that to match what the user is able to do with a ticket or a payment system and to see digitally. And what was really important was in 2019, Camo UK made a decision to be a flag bearer for the concept in the UK. I think that was probably related to its involvement in the Share North project alongside those other organisations, authorities in parts of Northern Europe that were actually implementing mobility hubs. And there are now certain local community schemes, we'll maybe hear about those later today. And there were some big applications, successful applications for transforming cities funding in the UK, Plymouth and Norwich and Solent area, and been other schemes as well that have been started or investigated, planned for in areas like Calderdale. Mobility hubs are featured in several bus service improvement plans. Not sure quite where those are going. Got my copy of Local Transport today this morning and realised that maybe we're not quite sure how many of those BSIPs will actually, even those funded BSIPs, will actually go forward and to what extent. But also at the same time, Go Ahead with Arup produced the concept of future mobility hubs, bus-based really mobility hubs in networks, and did that report in 2000 and 2020, I think, 2021. There was a successful conference that Landor ran earlier this year in May, and I think they're thinking of repeating that in future. Okay, what are the features of mobility hubs? Well, they vary, of course, in different places, but good walking and cycling access, things like bike sharing, micro-mobility of various sorts, car sharing, electrical vehicle charging, public transport interchange, DRT services. Beate mentioned in the last presentation the Hearts links service and the way that integrates or links into certain hubs. I've used it myself to get from a village to Stevenage railway station. Also, perhaps a place for crowdsourced public transport. I'll be using Zelo in a couple of weeks' time to go from a hub on the A14 to the NEC for the Euro bus show. And so the A14 services I'm going from is really potentially a hub, but I'll talk about a bit that later on as well. Parcel delivery collection points as well. Again, I was in the Northeast England not so long ago at Lealholm in the North Yorkshire Moors. Railway station there has Amazon parcel delivery lockers. And there's also the concept, not sure quite how it fits, to be honest, of urban car parks, large urban car parks as mobility hubs, but they aspire, or some owners of those aspire to have some elements of mobility hubs as part of that. Okay, this slide is all about sharing. What do mobility hubs do? They bring shared transport together in forms where people can access it easily, and it provides access through sustainable sharing of transport vehicles and services, sharing of space and assets, work hubs, parcel points, providing easy interchange. And the point about information and physical infrastructure working together, the physical infrastructure by the design of the hub, the signage of the hub, matching what is available for the traveller to use. Location of where they are is important because they need to be where people want to get to and from or congregate at. So economic activity and population are key to the siting of mobility hubs. My view of mobility hubs as well is that locating them on major public transport corridors, or as major as you can get in a rural area, is a key to their success as well. Okay, this is about the FIT Fellowship. So the computing facilities and access to software and data have been provided by the University of Plymouth, particularly using Esri's ArcGIS Pro system. Very, very powerful GIS system with loads and loads of algorithms there to manage and morph and analyze data. And also I've been using Basemaps track software to a certain extent as well. What was really important was access to data, for which the University of Plymouth has licenses. What's the rationale of the project? Well, it's to support or to enable a national strategy. And at a regional or national level, that decision on locating where those mobility hubs should go is really important and requires a methodology that is scalable. Sorry, just going down. So what have I been doing? Well, defining the complete set, if you like, the outer boundary, the population of potential locations of mobility hubs, and then clustering them. Two key factors around the identification of the population: NAPTANs, which stands for National Public Transport Access Nodes, which is a comprehensive, regularly, continuously maintained database of bus stops throughout the UK, railway stations, ferry terminals, and secondly, a concentration of buildings. So using the OPCS definition of built up areas. I live in a village in the Cambridge Green Belt. My village it's a reasonable size, but it's part of a built up area. It's defined by the statisticians as a built up area. Smaller villages round about are not. But built up areas might also exclude things which are kind of not adjacent to other buildings. So you can have a major superstore which is not in a built up area because it's on the edge of that area, it's just outside. So the process has involved selecting all the NAPTANs in built up areas and then fine tuning the result, doing manipulation of the sort I've just mentioned to allow things in that area, or to bring things into that area which would not otherwise be. So, for instance, Beate showed a photograph of Cam and Dursley station just now. I don't think that's in a built-up area, but it's a railway station that would need to be included for analysis. Secondly, to then form those clusters of NAPTANs, and also to identify NAPTANs that are not clustered, which might still be important, like, for instance, park and ride stops. There might only be one bus stop at a park and ride site. So it's an individual NAPTAN, if you like, but it still needs to be analysed. And then producing that total of potential mobility hub locations, and then analysing and scoring them. So what are the features that allow the locations to be identified from that set? Public transport service level, resident population, economic activity, really, really important. Various sorts of that. But during that process, certain facts, implications have come to light. For instance, the available data for many economic activity features is not consistent, not comprehensive, may actually be misleading. But car park data, where it's collected well, I would stress that, where it's collected well, appears to be a good proxy for several of those economic activity features. But unlike NAPTANs, unlike bus stops, there's no reliable database of car park locations that's freely available. NAPTANs are available to anybody. You can't get that for car parks. A second point is that potential interchange nodes have inconsistent pricing and time length rules that act against interchange. So if I go from my village northward by train, I go to Ely. Ely has a major number of long distance rail services. It cost me £3 to park my car at Ely station for a day. And that's a 10-minute walk, a specially designed car park by the district council set up for the railway station. If I go south from Cambridge, it's very, very different. Certain aspects of NAPTAN data are unreliable, but where should the effort be put in to get those right? So those are implications that come from this this work. Some conclusions: methodology could be applied across the GB, and probably including Northern Ireland as well, but it's going to need tweaking. There are issues that need to be addressed. I mentioned some of those in the previous slide, but things like land use planning, actually incorporating mobility hubs in land use policy, making space or allowance from them. The access and the connectivity and how we do DRT to make it, if not viable, make it low cost enough for it to be sustainable. How do we include that to make the hubs work? Also the issues around each hub in rural areas are going to be different, unlike suburban areas where it's fairly homogeneous. Lastly, the hierarchy of hubs within the network is an issue that my project doesn't cover. That's the second stage, building the hubs, where they should go, which they should put in first, is important. And those are my details, and that's it. I think I'm just within the 15 minutes.
Thank you very much, John. That's great. Somebody's asked about the information here, and those links with John will give you some of the data on that can be used elsewhere. Right, we've got a bit of time for responses from people. So firstly, can I ask Alistair Kirkbride, who is a consultant who's done a lot of work on leisure travel, particularly national parks, just to do, and has been a fellow of the foundation, just to do a 5-minute response to what Beate and John have said, and anything else you want to say.
Okay, thank you, Stephen. Jenny Milne might also be jumping into this because she'll be talking after this too, so we might end up doing a bit of a double act. Anyway, so we've had two fantastic presentations there, which I think are varied and broad, and I guess some of us recognise the places and the context that were being talked about, and others of us might not have done, or might not have been quite as familiar about them. So I've worked on national parks. The FIT was very generous in funding me to work on governance, which sounds rather arcane and dull, but it does get exciting, honestly. The argument being that barriers to movement in national parks are largely to do with governance rather than an absence of good ideas. So that's what I've been working on there. I also work on deeper rural areas, and by deeper rural, I mean deeper rural, where there might be one bus service a week. I'm not joking. I've just been working around Kirby Stephen. So some reflections on those talks then. There was a little bit of chatter about what do we mean by rural, and I think I would reflect some of the comments that have come back saying, let's not get too hung up about that. We all live modern lives that go between urban and rural areas, and I feel that there is the absolute clear stretch between city centres and out into the deeps of beyond. So I don't think we need to get hung up on that today. The one thing I think I'm going to reflect on here is we're talking still about encouraging people to change their travel behaviour. And I think my experience of national park and rural and leisure work is that, am I allowed to say this? People quite like it when they can't use the car, even in rural areas. And I'm going to make that point in two ways. During lockdown, a lot of places in national parks and rural leisure destinations, they had to start constraining car access in order to manage the number of cars that were there. And the silence of complaints was deafening of the response from people. I can challenge anyone to go to Penny Pass in Snowdonia, a dozen beaches I can think of around the country where car access was the norm up until lockdown. People like it when they're not allowed to drive their car to somewhere. If a new social contract has been put together whereby there is really good alternative access. And that is not just about cars being the problems, it's about pumping those revenues into those transport services. And therefore, I would suggest that we can start to think about that for broader rural areas. In that we've talked a lot today about encouraging, which is absolutely essential. We need the services to allow people to not use their cars. But when are we going to start thinking a little bit more about how we're going to start restricting car access in those rural areas? And I mean that because a lot of journeys from rural areas go to urban areas. And if we can still drive freely to those urban areas, we're still not going to have viable bus services in those rural areas. I've recently been working in Kirby Stephen, a town, well, a village of a couple of thousand on a good day, where we still have about 800 people going along a main commute corridor in the morning. Now 800 people, last time I looked, is the best part of 12 double-decker buses, and there's one small bus service a week along that corridor. Now, we can encourage people to use bus services, but when are we going to start thinking about restraining that car use? Now, a lot of people would say, but a lot of people don't have cars in rural areas, which is exactly true. And so in order to start to build economic models or resilient financial models for those rural bus services and other transport services, we need to start thinking about, well, why is all that money going into those petrol tanks of private cars? And I'm not saying this from a hit everybody over the head with a wet fish point of view. I'm saying this because where this is done, places get really good. And so therefore, my question is, where are the visions of what rural areas look like, which are car reduced and car restrained? Now we start to reach overseas. The Smarter project was fantastic. And I'm sure we can all reach to our favorite case studies of where really good places look like. We need that for the UK much better. So John, you've spoken an awful lot about mobility hubs, and you're implying what that will look like when that's laid out on the ground in the UK. And Beate's work is all pointing towards that it could be more like this. So I'm encouraging we need to go further. We need to say, look, these places could actually look, feel and function in the following sorts of ways, so that we can start to make appealing visions of what rural areas can look like, and therefore start to recruit people to want them to look like that. Now, going back to national parks, I would say there are an increasing number of places in national parks now, and in leisure contexts in the rural areas generally, that we can point to and say it could be like this. Do you want it like this, which is high frequency, low cost shuttle buses that get you there when you want to be, or jumping on your electric bike or your electric trike or whatever it might be? Or do you want it like that, which is you can only get there if you've got a car to begin with? So sorry to the quarter of the population that haven't. Oh, and by the way, you'll have a horrible time getting parked, and you'll probably end up parking on a verge somewhere and getting ticketed. So I'm sounding quite ranty, for which I apologise, and I promised myself I wasn't going to. But there's a positive, constructive point I'm trying to make here, which is I think we're kind of getting to the point where we could and should be much more confident in articulating clearly an appealing and compelling vision for what rural areas and leisure areas would look like in car-reduced times. I'm also working at the moment with Monica Busher at Lancaster University on societal readiness for decarbonisation, which is a great project, which is going in all sorts of directions that we weren't expecting. One of the big findings from that is society's kind of ready. People are ready for much more car-reduced lifestyles. You know, Beate, you picked up on, or you were mentioning about forced car ownership. A lot of people don't want to own cars. They don't want to use cars. A lot of people already mix up mobility. So I just feel that there is a rather poorly articulated vision out there, not just of what places could be like, but the silent majority of people that actually just don't want to use their cars. And therefore, I suppose the big question then is, who is going to take leads in articulating much more clearly what places and lifestyles could be like in that direction?
Thank you.
I'm going to leave it there.
Please, yes.
I'm also going to apologise to Jenny because I've just not said what we agreed we were going to talk about. So there we are. Back to you, Stephen.
Jenny, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I'll come in.
And just introduce yourself as well,
yeah,
please.
Yeah. I was going to say there's some familiar faces in the chat, but for those of you that don't know me, I wear many hats. One of them is a part-time PhD student on rural mobility as a service at Aberdeen University. The other is the founder of a social enterprise called Scottish Rural Islands Transport Community, which some of you will be familiar with, and also freelance under the name of JLM. Lots of points here, and there's lots of experts in the chat as well, and lots of practical questions and asks as well, which is totally realistic. I think for me, some of the themes that came out that were trust and confidence. And these are key things, whether you're somebody implementing, whether you're a user, it doesn't matter. We need to have trust and confidence in options, whether you have a mobility hub or whether you want to be able to access an e-bike. You need to have trust and confidence and accurate data. And these are things that we all know. I heard a phrase recently, and I apologize to the person that coined it because I can't remember who it was, but it was density isn't destiny. And I think that's really, really important to consider. One of the other subjects and taboo words that hasn't come up today at all is the word subsidy. And as many of you know, I've had this hoo-ha in my head about that discrepancy and inequality between how much we fund people per person per head for buses in particular cities versus more rural areas. Of course, pilots are going to happen and we're going to see choice of transportation where there's higher subsidy levels. So we need to sort of think about that monetary value aspect as well. Alistair touched on international, and I've been involved in the International Transport Forum Working Group on Rural Innovation. If you haven't seen it, it's a great publication with over 60, 70 practical case studies pulling on Smarter, Mamba, all these different projects that have happened. But one key aspect for me is something called a guaranteed ride. And I think this fits neatly with what we've been discussing and what we're going to discuss going forward, is that for people that live in rural areas, my background is real, that we need to have that guarantee that if the bus doesn't turn up or the EV charge point doesn't work, whatever it is, how do we actually get home? So there are examples of this, real world examples happening in Europe and America. So I just want to put that out there, that there are things happening that can help with this trust and with this confidence. And I think also, I'm going to disagree with Alistair slightly, which we always do, is about the car. I don't think we want to be car free. The car is an asset. We've already gone through a carbon cycle to get that car there. But controversially, how do you use that car, minibus, motorbike, whatever asset it is on the road? And that people parcels combination, many know that I'm passionate about this, have been for decades. There are projects, I've been involved in some of them. How do we make that happen where the car is already on the road and we use it for picking up prescriptions or an Amazon voucher, or we were chatting about lockers and things in the chat there, but actually look at it as an asset on the road. And we all know that many people living in rural areas don't have access to a car, they don't own the car, but they actually use a car, and that could be their neighbour, it could be their friend, whatever. So we can't write off the car. I just think we need to review the role of the car. And finally, Alistair, what I probably would say, and in response to what you've said, and Stephen, before you chase me for finishing, is that we need to start looking at rural proofing. And rural proofing is something that's happened in Scotland. It has got a ball rolling. It's maybe stalled over the last couple of years for obvious reasons, but we need to actually think about it. And there genuinely is a voice for rural now that wasn't there even 3-4 years ago. And I've talked about rural for 20 odd years. There is momentum there, and it's coordinating that. And everything that's in the chat, you're all knowledgeable, we're all sharing. We just need to make it happen and have a mindset change. And we need to get that mindset change so that the mobility hubs and all the projects that you're hearing about today can actually happen. Stephen.
Thanks so much, Jenny. Lots there. And the FIT Administrator Madeline has put some of your links in the chat, in fact, I think. Right, quick comment now from John Whitelake, who's another FIT fellow, if we can call them that, and who has done a lot of work on rural transport, particularly in Shropshire and around Ludlow. John, do you want to give some reflections on what you've heard and possibly some links to the things you've been working on?
Yes, thanks, Stephen, and thanks for organising this session. It's very important. I've worked on rural transport issues, displaying my great age, since 1976, when I was a transport officer in the Outer Hebrides, organising transport in North Uist and Benbecula, South Uist, Eriskay and Barra. My views, and I'm grateful to the Foundation for Integrated Transport for supporting projects, are slightly different to most people's views, in that I think, first of all, we need a completely different approach to the way we tackle this kind of work. Part of this is called citizen science. What is the will of the people? What do people want? What is the support? And Alistair has referred to some of those issues anyway, linking that to best practice and then linking it to the process of political change. And the good news is that there is no problem at all with achieving massive reduction in car use, massive reduction in carbon dioxide emissions from the transport sector, and doing that in a way that actually benefits the majority of people in terms of accessibility, mobility, public health, and so on. I just want to make 2 or 3 basic points that sort of sit within that overall methodological or indeed philosophical approach. First of all, and I get in trouble for saying this, there's no such thing as a rural transport problem. There is such a thing as a lack of imagination, and there is such a thing as defeatists, that we can't solve rural transport problems. And this is all about changing mindsets. And I'm going to put something, if it works, in the chat function to explain what the evidence is for that statement. Secondly, we have got massive sources of information, which I will call best practice. How to improve things, how the ways we improve things are less costly than not doing it. The high costs of our transport system in the UK and in rural areas especially are associated with a lack of imagination on modal transfer, walking, cycling, public transport in rural areas. And we need to learn from best practice. There isn't time. I'm deliberately being quite brief, which Stephen will be surprised about because he thinks that I take the opposite stance on this matter. Two quick examples. I've worked a lot in Dornach in Switzerland, looking at totally integrated rural public transport and the Swiss approach to pulse timetabling. There isn't time to talk about that now, but there are splendid and clever ways of sorting out things that in England especially we seem to find difficult, coordinated public transport services in rural areas. Similarly, I spent a lot of time living in rural Sweden, in a small settlement called Järna, where I can use 26 buses a day. I count them. I'm a very boring geographer. I've counted them from 6 o'clock in the morning till 11 p.m. at night, 26 buses a weekday, only half that number on Saturdays and Sundays. The dense public transport network, highly integrated. I can travel in a region much bigger than Shropshire for 75 minutes for £3, using as many buses and as many trains as possible. That's just a tiny, tiny, tiny bit of best practice. There's loads of best practice, but the problem is we're not applying it in Britain as a whole. And my final point, and I hope I have put these correctly in the chat because that sometimes goes wrong, is that we've now done a similar approach to sorting out transport in South Shropshire. This is a rural part of of Shropshire. This is the Ludlow constituency, population 85,000, with the full cooperation of Philip Dunn, the MP. And what we've shown is, with a massive report and a massive amount of work and citizen engagement, we can reduce transport carbon by 47% by 2030. No argument, no defeatism, no nonsense, no difficulty, dead easy. All it needs is tweaking central government so we get more intelligence, tweaking Shropshire Council so we get more intelligence, and cooperating across the whole supply chain of public transport. So we're pushing at an open door. We can massively improve public transport, massively reduce car use, and do it all very successfully and improve public health and reduce public costs, but politicians tend not to want to do it. So please, will you all tell me how to change the minds of politicians so that they do want to do it? Finished, Stephen?
Yeah, thank you very much. That's great. And a final comment, Marianne Quick, who is here representing Hope Valley Climate Action, which has developed the Travelling Light project. Marianne, some reflections on what you've heard and perhaps a little bit about Travelling Light, if you want to.
Yeah, sure. Thanks very much. So Travelling Light is a project based in the Hope Valley in the Peak District National Park. And the Hope Valley, if any of you have been, is a collection of around 11 villages between Manchester and Sheffield. And so Travelling Light was really grateful for the Foundation for Integrated Transport's bridging funding that we received earlier this year, which enabled us to start the project before receiving 12 months funding from the Department for Transport. So it's a project for low carbon travel, and it hopefully will bring together some of the initiatives that we've talked about this afternoon here. It's structured around 4 main themes, each with a focus on building and maintaining community engagement through activism, advocacy and awareness raising. So that's strengthening priority for pedestrians and cyclists, switching to public and shared transport, including the vast number of tourists that visit the area, reimagining car ownership through car shares, trials on electric vehicles and e-bikes, and also driving-free days and driving-free zones, and also about spreading change and storytelling, and giving communities the opportunity to reimagine the places where they live and their villages. So over the next 12 months, we'll be building our capacity to organise in communities through community consultations and conversations based in each of the 11 villages. So it's communities' opportunity to sort of help shape and map where those safer roads need to be, what bus networks they need, what features they want in the mobility hubs that have been partly funded by the Bus Service Improvement Plan. And a key aspect is using some of that funding to establish a rural an urban youth advocacy programme so that young people get to be part of our sustainable travel narrative and design their own Use the Bus campaign and use and how to become active travel to become more safer. So there's a whole piece of work focused on mapping the Hope Valley with 20's Plenty campaign in each of the villages, quiet lane initiatives, and exploring partnerships with the vast number of tourist businesses in the area to explore sponsorship of demand responsive transport using the existing community transport organisations that are there. So we see our role as joining up individuals, joining up organisations, and fundamentally winning hearts and minds by working with communities. And if we can't give people hope in a place called the Hope Valley, then we should all pack up and go home now. So it's really exciting project that I'm looking forward to working with some of the people who've been on this call to find out more about some of the solutions. Oh, and we're looking for people to join our National Steering Committee. So if anybody's interested in that, then please do drop me a line. Hopefully more information about the project and my contact details can go in the chat. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Marianne. And some of the links are in the chat, in fact, for your project and for getting involved. Well, look, thanks ever so much to everybody for well, keeping to time mostly, and for a really interesting set of presentations. I've been looking at the chat and people have been really engaged with that. I've got a few questions I've pulled off the chat for various people to answer. One, a lot of talk about e-bikes. Ruth Merkus has been asking about should we just take compulsory purchase orders to create for land to create high quality dedicated cycle routes alongside main roads, as is done in the Netherlands. I think that's that's what she was saying. Whereas here there's a tendency to protect verges. I mean, I wonder, Beate, with the Beate and Alistair feel like people who might want to say something about that. Beate, do you want to comment?
Oh, I know the problem in Calder Valley. We have the Greenway that's been, I can't remember how long it's been under discussion, but there's a landowner blocking a walking and cycling route along the Ryburn Valley. I've relocated to France, where I am told there is no such obstruction. It's just a different way of running land purchasing. Any land that goes up for sale has to be offered to the government before any contract's done. So we could definitely do things differently in terms of way we manage land and for transport and communal purposes. I don't know what you think, Alistair.
Yeah, I mean, wouldn't it be great? I know in national parks, there are dedicated, quiet teams of people trying to get on with landowners to get agreements. And I mean, where it works well, it's brilliant. It's absolutely fantastic. But yeah, all you need is one landowner that says no, and that's the end of it, really. Now, part of this is down to payments for land use by farmers as well. So it's not just that they're being nasty, but there's an economic reason why they probably don't want to do it. I would say, though, I think I put a comment in chat, but I might not have done, on Backroads project funded by the Rhys Jeffreys Road Fund that we're working on. There's an awful lot of really, 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 really good places to go cycling already on back roads. And yes, we do need cycle routes in certain places, but I suspect complete guesswork, so someone tell me off, I suspect more than 90% of journeys by active travel in rural areas already have a good, safe route for them. So I don't think we ought to maybe suggest that until we have lots and lots of safe routes, active travel is dangerous. It isn't. There's still loads of really good places to go. I'm spying the artist's face here.
Yeah, no, I think it depends where you are, Alistair.
No, absolutely. No, I'm completely open with that. This is the continuum of rural areas, isn't it, I suppose? But the idea that active travel is dangerous because you're going to get run over, I think, can be quite dangerous sometimes in terms of holding things back.
So just to give it's discontinuous, and this is the problem, that if you have one section of fast A road on a journey that's otherwise safe, that is still it's a blocker. My mother-in-law lives in South Cheriton, a very nice little village, a mile from the local station. I would love to walk to the station, but it's a fast A road with no verge, nothing. And you can't, you could possibly trample along the nettle-filled ditch, but not in your best suit because you're going to a meeting in London. And yes, I think there's the discontinuity and the fact that you may have that most journeys will take in even a small stretch of something that is beyond my risk aversion is a big issue.
And actually, you put in your presentation about new housing developments building in no pavements, and which means that we're actually going backwards in some cases. There's been a lot of questions about the lack of public transport and the cost of rural, and I just wondered whether anybody wants to address that. John, you talked about John Whiteleg, you talked about free fares and so on. Did you want to say something about that?
Yes, thank you, Stephen. I think the cost of public transport is by no means the most important, but it's one of the top three. The service frequency is very important, and the ability to be able to switch between buses and trains and buses and in many combinations is important. And I look at this in other countries and just shake my head about why we are so backward in the UK as a whole. So first of all, I think we need to go down the route of increasing service frequency, of having some clear standards like they do in Switzerland, and secondly, having some excellent fair deals like the one I referred to very, very briefly in Sweden, where you have a totally integrated fare offer, and you use a smart card and you pay your £3 and you can travel for 75 minutes, jumping off as many buses and trains in any combination you like, on any journey purpose you like, which significantly improves ridership. So I will do those first. I think the case for totally free public transport is very strong, and I know there's a debate, simply because we have a kind of an Amazonian rainforest of complexity at the moment in terms of funding, in terms of all the different ways in which we allegedly subsidise or we transfer funds to operate public transport operators, the way we transfer millions in profits to the shareholders of people that run buses, and mopping all that up in one highly coordinated system that benefits everybody, the young and the old, people going to schools, people going to colleges, people making trips to hospitals and GP surgeries. There's a lot of potential linked to increases in service frequency, and also linked to transferring some of the 34 billion from road building. So I think the case is clear, and I'm working on that at the moment. And if anyone is interested, please do something to contact me. Stephen knows how to do it and I don't, and we can cooperate. So we have to tackle the twin tasks: service frequency, service reliability on the one hand, and the cost on the other hand. And there are ways of doing it, and that means we can achieve totally decarbonised transport on a timescale that's reasonable. And in the South Shropshire project, we set 2030. We didn't get to total decarbonisation, we only got to 47%. So we're still trying.
Thank you. Jenny, you wanted to come in.
Yeah, I was just going to tie in that with John on those underpin the reasons why mass is such a challenge for so many.
Do you want to say
countries.
what mass is? Because
I'm sure plenty of the audience knows, but mobility is a service. And I'll agree to disagree with Stephen, maybe it was John that said it earlier on, that it's a platform for payments, because I think depending really, I can't remember who said it earlier, it's really very different in rural areas. And I say that with a PhD hat on. But these issues, John, that you're saying about payment and how we structure payments and how we do payments and how we pay people in the back end and the front end, there are people on this call that have first-hand experience of this, but it genuinely is why that whole idea of integrated transport with whatever layers you want to put on it for mobility as a service globally are not succeeding because they just don't know how to do it. So until we start to unravel some of these small, in inverted commas, issues, we can't actually take that next step to go towards mass. How do you pay people? How do you reimburse stakeholders, service providers, transport operators, etc.? So John, your 3 wish lists, I think everybody probably on the call would love to conquer and achieve.
Thank you. I want to I put in the chat a link to Transport for Cornwall, and I just wanted to say that they've done some of this, so that you do have, it's a rural county with a lot of visitor travel, and they have managed to make, and also they seem to have managed to persuade central government to give them money to reduce fares. So you pay no more than £5 a day for travelling, less if you're under 19, and there's family tickets as well and weekly tickets as well. One of the things they did was they've been doing is making use of any available funding. So for example, they got their local enterprise partnership to fund ticketing equipment on all the bus operators that talks to each other. And having just been there and experienced it, it's London style, tap on, tap off, on any bus, same fare. And they've got town zones as well, which are £2.50 a day for travelling across. And they have, there are services in the evenings on Sundays as well. So I would say, and there's lots of places in the UK that are like that and could be more like that. And they choose not to be. So I'm with John on that. So I think there are, that's a good one. And I think the other place to watch is Wales, where the Welsh government is moving in this direction as well, and is reviewing its roads programme. I think is looking at doing some of the dedicated cycle routes along main roads, and franchising bus services and so on. So there are examples in the UK that you can look at. Other questions. Various people have asked about kind of the nitty-gritty on business models, tariffs. John Austin, who owns hubs, and how do you charge for them? What's the tariffs?
Business modelling, or getting the business model right, is very difficult and will vary in different areas. It could be the landowner, it could be the local authority. I would say that essentially it's got to be the local authority very, very deeply involved in planning these things and in making them happen. I would also refer people to Como UK. They're doing a lot of work on business models for mobility hubs. Not sure it's got right yet, but they've been researching this area a lot.
Just following that, Beate, do you want to say a bit about business models in relation to on-demand transport and some of the issues you and Padam have tripped over in this?
Yes, so with on-demand transport, it's very much about offering transport in areas where it's not commercially viable, full stop. We've seen, it's teaching your grandmother to suck eggs, we've seen corridorisation of bus routes over the years, so that only the major bus operators only run high frequency bus services along corridors, because those are the kinds of things that make money, and they are in the business of making money because they're answerable to shareholders. Off-corridor routes are the ones that suffer from this, and trimming away these capillaries also has an impact on the high frequency corridors. So there is a little bit of chicken and egg, but the basic problem is that your feeder routes don't make money in barely anywhere. So with on-demand transport, you're substituting infrequent, highly subsidised feeder routes with area-based systems. You're not going to suddenly make an infrequent subsidised feeder route profitable, by substituting an on-demand system, but you may actually get more people to travel using it. And Hertfordshire County Council recognised this when they put together the Hearts Link service. So it's not about we're going to make this suddenly into a goose that lays a golden egg. It's how do we get the most people travelling, getting to where they need to get to for the money that we have available. You can't run an overall commercial bus system and I think the UK is a kind of 40-year experiment in whether it's possible, and I think we've probably got a reasonably good conclusive outcome now, i.e. it's not.
Alistair, you talked about you talked about Snowdonia and the model there of charging for car parking and putting the money into upgraded public transport. Do you want to say a bit more about that? Because I think a lot of people on the call will be really interested in that. Yeah. I'm aware that people here want to hear about things they could do here, they could point to here to councillors and officers who don't believe anything can be done except allowing more and more space for SUVs to be driven everywhere and parked everywhere.
Yeah, I think so. The Snowdonia piece of work was, one of several across national parks where they've recognised that the deluge of cars, certainly during various lockdowns and post-lockdowns, something had to be done. So Penny Pass, which is one of the most popular setting off points for going up Snowdon itself, it was chaos. The car park had about 70 places, and sometimes there were nearly 500 cars parked illegally on verges down, no, not illegally, parked on verges down the approaching roads. So what the Park Authority in partnership with the Transport Authority locally did was restrict parking at that car park to 70 odd places and up the price, properly enforce car parking on the verges and set up a small car park just outside Llanberis down the road, which is one of the setting up points, with a relatively low cost but commercially viable shuttle bus that takes people up to the pass. And this is, as I was saying earlier, the deafening silence. Visitors were quite happy with this. The roads weren't cluttered with cars. People could still go for their walk. They didn't have to worry about whether they could get parked or not. Emergency services could get through, buses could get through, it worked. It wasn't all plain sailing. So the youth hostel at the top of Penny Pass had a bit of a problem with staff getting to work, but that's a teething problem. That's not a fundamental problem. But I think it's just a really good example where you have in visitor areas where the visitor car access is a real problem, a new social contract with those visitors by providing low cost public transport, but also putting the differential in terms of charging for the car parking to fund it is fine. It seems to go down okay because people just really want a good day out. Now, I know that's very different to the debates about, the more routine utilitarian public transport in rural areas, but an awful lot of the problems in visitor areas in rural areas can be tackled using slightly different approaches here. And I think the Penny Pass example is just a good example of that. And I would encourage people to Google it.
Thank you. Marianne, do you want to comment on that?
Sorry, I didn't hear that, Stephen.
No, a comment about the Penny Pass example in Snowdonia and people being prepared to visitors being prepared to reduce the car travel.
Yeah, I mean it's a real challenge, and we've got to take inspiration from those case studies where they exist. There's somewhere similar in the Peak District. Stanage Edge is a very popular destination for climbers in particular, and there is no other way of accessing that part of Derbyshire without a car at the moment. So it's a black spot in terms of public transport. So one of the things we'll be looking at with communities around there is how that could be served via a link of some type of demand responsive transport and awareness raising with those recreation groups to link them into those possibilities.
Could I just add, Stephen, work that I've been doing with Martin Higgett in Northumberland and Loch Lomond and various other people at the moment, I think there's a real shift in emphasis now, and Marianne, I think this is, well, we've spoken about this with the Hope Valley stuff over the last couple of years, I suppose, with the group. There is this absolute sense that in national parks, it's all about landscape and landscape protection. And visitors to national park get that. They've signed up to it, they subscribe to it. And I think what's happened over the last couple of years in response to lockdown is visitors recognise that if the social contract is about, I'm helping to protect the landscape, I will do my bit so long as you provide me with alternative access. And that has been a really, I'll call it an experiment, because it was an experiment. Okay, it was forced into it, but I think it just exposes this idea that certainly people, when they are visitors, are kind of up for an alternative way of getting to places. We don't have to be scared of that. I think we can be really confident about saying we just have to provide the services to allow people to access places in that way.
Thank you. John Whiteleg, you wanted to comment?
Thanks, Stephen. I think I've said all I need to say that, in this meeting so far. I am constantly amazed and astonished how these problems are routinely solved in Switzerland, in Sweden and Germany, with massive assistance to public transport in rural areas and national park equivalent areas, massive good deals. I mean, there isn't time to talk about these things. I just put something in a chat about the Konus card, which I use in Germany.
That's right.
But there's masses of these things. Even in a box standard region of Germany that isn't a tourist area, you've got my German's appalling, so do forgive me, Anrufsammeln Taxi. In other words, if you're using public transport and you kind of run out of time because the last train has gone or the last bus has gone, don't worry, you ring this number and you get a taxi for €3 and it comes and picks you up and takes you to your final destination. It's just that we're drowning, absolutely drowning in fantastic examples of intelligent application of modal transfer and promoting the alternatives to the car. And Britain is probably one of the best countries in the world for ignoring best practice. So what we need to do is not change the public transport system, but change our politicians. Thank you.
Thank you. Somebody's asked, Michael Milton has asked about raising car occupancy as a way forward in rural areas. Beate, do you want to comment on that? I don't know whether you're the right person. Anybody else want to do it? But as a way,
I'll do it if you want.
Go on then.
Wants to. Yeah, the car occupancy is what I was getting at with the asset side of things, that you've already paid for it. So why are we not maximising what it can do and who it takes and what it takes? We're very key on trying to bring people into cars, and we all know I'm familiar with car clubs and the work Como do and car sharing. And Alistair will remember this SRITC cafe with passion when we were talking about hitchhiking. Do you remember that, Alistair? And the project of Réseau, which has taken place in France and I believe Belgium as well, whereby actually it wasn't high tech. And agree, John, we've got lots of solutions, and we keep sometimes reinventing the wheel. But when we're talking about car occupancy, quite a lot of things come back to that trust and confidence side of things as well. Can you trust the person that's coming into the car with you that you don't know? So there's a lot to unpick. But one of the phrases I usually say is informal versus formal ways of transportation, and a lot of informal travel happens, and we have a lot of car sharing that doesn't go through an application or a website or a paid project that's happening. I speak to my neighbour and I get a lift or whatever. That's not tracked, and that's where that hitchhiking element comes in as well, because I think, what was the phrase, Alistair, you used? It wasn't hitchhiking, it was something else that you came up with. Can you remember? No, that phrase says no. But the point being that we can increase occupancy. It's just the methods that we use and how do we do that, and what's your comfort zone to be able to do that. And there are many sharing platforms out there. People register their travel, but do you actually ever get the engagement? So you do the nice thing of offering your lift or your share, but does it actually come back to you? And it's not just about cars, it's about bikes. Have you got a bike sitting in the shed that somebody could go and use, which again comes back to being an asset that could be utilised. You're mute, Stephen.
Thanks very much. Sorry. Finally, because we're in the last minute or two of this, we're finishing at 1:30. Can people want to say one thing they'd really like to happen next. Beate, what would you like to happen next, apart from re-regulating all the buses, reopening all the railway lines, the beach enclosed, and putting high quality e-bike lanes around alongside every A road? Apart from that, do you have an immediate wish list?
I think the small scale, there are two things that one's small scale and one's big scale. I think the small scale thing is about local authorities really embracing people who have got good ideas in their local authority. I think a number of times I speak to projects or even small businesses that are going, we're going to do something that's climate friendly and gets people out of cars. And see, then the local authority doesn't seem to just embrace them and go, right, okay, you're doing this thing, we're going to really massively support you to do this. It's kind of like, oh, are you sure? And I think we in the UK particularly, I see it elsewhere where it happens much more frequently that someone has a good idea in the continent that they get aided and abetted. I think we could do a lot more aiding and abetting from the structures in society to small projects that can change the world, and rather than treating them with suspicion. And then the other thing on a macro level is mapping. I think that mapping is when Alistair and Marianne were talking about it, mapping is a really crucial way. People think that because they can go to a point on a map in their car, they'll automatically be able to park there. I think we need to be talking on a macro level to all of the Apple, Google, the big maps, the things that you have in TomToms and things, and saying, really, can you say, no, your nearest parking space is here and this is where you're going to end up. You're not just going to be able to drive willy-nilly and park anywhere in rural off areas. So two things. Sorry for the two.
Thank you. John Austin, one quick thing.
Yeah, an understanding that the integration of transport planning and land use planning are crucial. The DFT and whatever the Department for Local Government is now called, was called Levelling Up, wasn't it? Together with the subnational transport bodies, understand that mobility hubs are crucial. Fully agree with Beate about mapping. Absolutely, that's a brilliant point.
John Whiteleg, I know you've got to leave.
Yeah, very quickly, Stephen. Fundamental institutional and organisational reform modelled on the German Verkehrsverbund system. No time to go into detail, but it's a regional authority, so we have some experience of regional authorities in this country, but with all the funding and all the powers to coordinate and to produce a transport plan, and a transport plan based on what are we actually trying to achieve by the year 2. So forget all this nonsense about forecasting, and forget all the nonsense about appraisal, and forget all the nonsense about cost-benefit analysis, and just set out a plan. This is where we want to be in 2030, modal split, walking, cycling, public transport, reducing air pollution, reducing carbon, and we will get there, and we will do it, and we will be well funded. So we need to scrap most of what local government does and central government does and put it in the hands of an organisation very similar to the Verkehrsverbund, which are still thriving in Germany.
Thanks for that. We're almost out of time. Jenny, one quick thing.
I'll not repeat the others. Controversially, probably I'd like to see local authorities revisit their routing for buses, because they're so historic, the routes. It doesn't represent where people want to go, and stop cutting our bus services because you're providing services that nobody wants to use because they don't go where they go. We know where we want to go. Please review your bus schedules.
Thank you. The Welsh are doing that now. Alistair.
Because I agree with almost everything that's just been said, I'm going to say clear, appealing visions of what rural areas and especially rural visitor areas could be like, rather than how they currently are, rather than making everything a little less bad. Let's just have some really clear visions of how things could be on a really, really good day. And then just to get public appetite for how things could be, and to build that momentum.
And Marianne.
Yeah, what Alistair said, but primarily that community engagement piece where we can understand what people want as part of that vision, and to rebuild trust in communities. So things like car sharing, e-bike sharing, all those things become normalised as part of everyday lives.
Thank you very much. time to wrap up. I'd like to thank all the speakers for comments and everybody who's joined this and put really great stuff in the chat. That won't be lost. All of this will be online, and we'll be able to put this out there. And we will. There will be other webinars. So to be confirmed. A final comment from me. Have been doing this with the University of Hertfordshire because I got fed up with below the line comments in any newspaper, particularly actually in the Guardian and New Statesman, are the places where you find below the line comments that go, it's all very well talking about reducing car use in London because you've got good public transport there, but out here, which turns out to be sometimes in Harrow, everybody has to drive everywhere because there's no public transport. So I think what we've demonstrated is there are options for reducing car use in rural areas and for reducing reliance on the car in places outside cities.
Yeah.
We've demonstrated lots of ideas here and a lot of good practice actually here and abroad that could be followed. I think what we have to do is just because councillors and officers sometimes only talk to people who are car dependent and who love being, that 9% of people who actually are Jeremy Clarksonites in Beate's thing, that's where Beate's typology, they tend to think that everybody, the other 81% are like the 9% and design policy around that. And I think we've got to get to the point, as Alistair said, of setting out clear visions. Places like Cornwall, Snowdonia, Loch Lomond, elsewhere are starting to do this now. Travelling light in the Hope Valley. There are places now where you can actually go and see this stuff. My final comment, I went to Cornwall, I did drive there, stayed there 10 days, the car moved 3 times because there was public transport and you could get to places by it and it was reasonably good. And there seemed to be a lot of people using it. Yeah. So thanks particularly to Brogan for making this work and for actively managing this and for putting everything around. Thanks to all the speakers and to the contributors. And see you again.